All right. Thank you. So yeah, just on top of the housekeeping notes, because of the cold, there's been some signal issues. Like I don't think the cold really affects wireless signal, but it can affect the hardware or whatever. And so this morning I was a little spotty. It's been fine for the last few hours, so I'm not anticipating anything. But if at any point I just disappear, I've already worked with Maria to like I'll log back in using my phone. So there's if there is an interruption, it'll just be like for a minute. But hopefully that won't even happen. Um, but yeah, and I will also, Maria, feel free to jump in at any point if you notice anything or if the audio is messed up or anything. Um, so yeah, I mean the title is zooming in poetry as an entry point into violence prevention work. And I like to say right away that like my background is in kind of critical education stuff, so the webinar format is always a little weird. Like I'd rather, be in a room where like I can ask a question and then we write everyone's responses on the board. But I know some of the interactivity in a webinar can just be like a little awkward. So I'm gonna kind of just walk through some of what I'm thinking about with regards to this topic. And if people do have questions, like Maria said, you can type them in the box. There'll be a couple spots we can stop. And then at the end, again, if people have any thoughts or questions, please feel free to share those. Um, yeah, my hope is that, well, one, I know right away that like not everyone is interested in poetry, and like that's perfectly okay. I think there are a couple things that are specific about poetry and spoken word specifically that can be useful, especially for people who are in that like prevention education box. But then I think for everyone, even if you're not in that group in the poll, there are certain aspects of like the approach that poets take or the techniques that we use or the tools that we use that I think can be relevant to people who do other kinds of work too around this particular issue. I'm thinking about, I mean, a lot of this comes down to communication. So I'm thinking about like if you have to raise funds for your agency, if you're engaged in any kind of culture shifting or money making or, that's not the right term, fundraising work. I think some of this stuff might be relevant and useful. And then I think even, just communication on people who do face-to-face, like frontline work, hopefully there'll be something relevant in there for you as well. Um, yeah, I guess, well, we'll get into that a little bit more. Um, in terms of who I am, in case that's interesting to anyone. So yeah, my name is Kyle. My stage name is Wante. I'm a spoken word poet, but my background is in social justice education, and then specifically a lot of the work that I do is going to colleges and high schools and middle schools to talk specifically about gender violence prevention, consent, healthy sexuality, and then a lot of what I do is around masculinity. There's a big kind of space right now in this country for those types of conversations about like critical masculinity, toxic masculinity stuff. And so a lot of what I do is using poems as entry points into those conversations. Like I'm much less interested in my poems themselves being like incredible life-changing pieces of work. I think what's really useful about poetry is that it can become an entry point, which is part of the title of this webinar. Yeah, we'll talk more about that as well. The other side of what I do, aside from the kind of arts-based prevention stuff, is I work with youth directly here in the Twin Cities with an organization called True Art Speaks. We run like youth poetry slams, youth open mics, writing workshops, spaces for young people to not just like write poetry, but to tell their stories and to like stand up on stage in front of people and say something that is important to them and be validated for it, and then also be challenged and like have critical conversations. And so all of my work kind of exists at the intersection of youth stuff and art stuff and social justice stuff, if that makes sense. And that I think will become more clear as we go on. So, oh yeah. Whoops. Okay. The kind of the framing for what I'm thinking about with regards to this issue is kind of two things. Like I said, spoken word specifically as a tool for people who do education and engagement work, especially with youth. And then my definition of youth, by the way, is I think pretty broad. Like I said, I tend to work with high schoolers, kind of starting in like the 7th, 8th grade range up through like undergrads and college. So that kind of like, 12 to 24 age range. Like that's how I think about youth. But a lot of the stuff can be relevant to younger kids too, and then can be relevant to adults as well. But that's kind of my focus, is that range. Um, and then beyond that, I'll look at some of the techniques and approaches that poets and other artists use that might be useful for people, I think, especially who do programming and education work, even if that work has nothing to do with poetry or spoken word or the arts even. Again, this is about this deeper idea of how artists engage with issues and how that can be relevant to communication. So yeah, if we were all in a big room together, I'd ask like, oh, do people have any like guiding questions, or what's your experience with spoken word? But I'll just keep moving. We will have some time. But I figured one way to really kick this off before we get into any of the material that's really specific to doing violence prevention and consent, healthy sexuality work, etc., is just to back up a little bit and talk a little bit more generally about what spoken word is, because I think it's the kind of thing, there's just a ton of misconceptions and a ton of like stereotypes. And I know when I tell people that I do slam poetry or spoken word poetry, that the first thing most of them think of is like that one scene in 22 Jump Street where like Jonah Hill does like a terrible slam poem. Or, if you just Google spoken word poetry, there's a lot of really bad stuff that comes up. And so I wanted to just like back up and talk about that a little bit, because that then I think can inform some of the rest of what we're talking about. What I often tell students is that like, we don't have to overthink this. Like spoken word is basically poetry that you write to be performed out loud. If we do want to get a little more like complex with it, or a more nuanced definition, I think it's a type of writing and performance that incorporates a lot of different other types of writing and performance. It's a hybrid form. It's poetry, but it also has lots of elements of like prose and rhetoric, elements of theater, the idea of like becoming a character, even if that character is just you. It's the idea that there's a difference between reciting something and performing something, putting the emotion into it and the kind of dynamism of a performer. There's also, stand-up comedy, hip hop, jazz, storytelling, just giving a speech, like all of these different forms, written and performance forms, kind of mashed together. The idea being that for young people, I mean, not just young people, but for everyone who does spoken word, like you can talk about whatever you want to talk about in whatever way you want to talk about it. Which can be really intimidating, I think. But once you kind of wrap your head around that, it can also be really, really empowering, because you get to develop your own style and tell your story, talk about the things that are important to you. And that's the other part here. Even for audiences or people who have no interest in like poetry, whether that's because of stereotypes or just because of like legitimate taste, like I just don't like poetry, that's fine. I think spoken word and spoken word spaces are about telling our stories, expressing ourselves, and creating space to think critically about issues. And that becomes really important once we start talking about issues of like gender and toxic masculinity and gender violence. What I've seen in poetry slams and open mic spaces are like, these become, I guess, platforms on which people, and especially young people, but people can have deeper conversations than maybe what we get to have like on Twitter or even just with our peers or our family. We can push a little bit further, because with poetry, sometimes there's an expectation that you're doing something that's more like has more depth or whatever. That isn't always true, but that's like the idea. And so I think the other part of this is the context of it. That might be more relevant even in how spoken word and like the way that I'm talking about this in this webinar today, it isn't just about the art practice of doing spoken word. It's about this larger culture of people doing poetry slams and open mics and sharing their poems on Instagram and YouTube and stuff like that. Like I think these spaces are really, really interesting as spaces for solidarity, education, and growth. And like I said, critical thinking around these issues as well. So yeah, we can. There's so much, like this isn't a webinar on just what spoken word is. Like I could talk for a really, really, really long time about it. But I think we'll come back to some of this stuff when we talk about really, really specific applications, like programming applications and education applications of this large idea that I'm exploring today. So we'll come back to some of this. In the meantime, I wanted to share, not that people are going to click on these right now and look at them, but if you'll get the slides afterwards, these are some of my favorite resources. One of them is, well, this is me. Like, it's the first chapter of my book, but it's available online. It's called 10 Things I've Wished to Know About Spoken Word and Slam Poetry. So if people have any, additional questions about kind of the terminology stuff or the definitions or whatever, that can be like a good primer. It's short and it's available online. I think the second link, again, we'll come back to some of this when we talk about application, but the second link is something I'm really, really excited about. Part of my like grad school research was how arts approaches impact social justice education spaces, or can be used to make those spaces more critical. So like first year orientation programs, or like, corporate diversity trainings, or, the type of work that advocates do, going into the health classes in the high schools to talk about this stuff. And so what I did, I put together a list of 100+ videos of spoken word poems that are organized by issue. And so particularly relevant to this conversation, there's like, here's a dozen videos of people talking about consent in an artistic, dynamic, engaging way. Here are a dozen videos of people talking about kind of rape culture and gender violence. Here are a dozen videos of people talking about critical masculinity stuff. And so the idea being like, if you get nothing else out of this webinar today, like if these tactics and approaches aren't relevant to you, I hope that list can be useful. And we'll talk more about how to use that list as we go on in this. But that's something I'm really excited about. It's a bunch of different videos of people who represent like different identities too. So depending on who your audience is, who your people you're working with are, that can be useful. And then the other one people may already know about, like Button Poetry, which is this huge database of spoken word videos. And that's that's more of a background resource if you're just interested in this in a more general sense. They travel around the country filming spoken word events and poetry slams, and every day they just post one new video. So it's a really cool snapshot of where the culture is at right now, featuring people from all over the country. But yeah, so I guess if questions do come up, I'll just keep checking the box. It doesn't seem like I don't see anything right now. And we'll just keep moving. I'm sorry if I repeat myself, but like I said, some of this is going to come up again. We'll talk more specifically about spoken word in a little while. But I think, like I said, this isn't just about poetry. I know a lot of people don't like poetry, and like that's perfectly acceptable. This is about, I think, this bigger principle, which I think about as translation. The idea that, well, I want to share what this means for me as an artist, but then I also want to share what this means to me as an activist, because I think, it's very, very much related, but it isn't exactly the same thing. But it might be useful to start with on the art side of things. I think about the idea of poetry, like a poet's job is to take these like big abstract ideas and issues and values and principles and feelings that we have and translate them into something that is just fundamentally like smaller, something that is concrete, that people can understand on like a deeper level than just an intellectual level. But again, how do we take these huge issues and ideas and turn them into like memories or moments or images or objects or something like that? So like some examples of that in poetry, like I can stand up on a stage and like shout at people and say like, hey, racism is bad, stop being racist, it's bad. And like that's true, and you might agree with it and you might nod your head, but it's not a very interesting poem, right? So rather than talk about the issue, I think what's interesting is to approach that issue through the lens of a story, or through the lens of an image, or through the lens of the specific memory I have in which that issue means something to me. And then you tell that story, right? So like a poem about environmental justice can instead be a poem about like a lonely polar bear cub who is starving and is gonna die. Like that's sad, but the sadness is what engages people, or like the image is what engages people. The example I always use is like, you can write a poem about war, or you can write a poem about the first time you step into your brother's empty bedroom. And you can tell me like, what does it look like? What does it sound like? How does it make you feel? What does it smell like? By telling that story, you get to say something deeper about this larger concept of war, right? Young people I work with tend to write about the same stuff, right? Like we write a lot about like mental health, write about love, write about family. And again, the challenge is you can write about family, or you can write about a specific memory you have in which the concept of family actually meant something to you. So the idea here is that, this isn't probably anything super revelatory, but uh, human beings tend to understand images more than we understand like ideas, right? On a very basic level. So the example that I have up here is like a poem about love. You can take that big concept of love and then zoom in on it. This is like an exercise we do in poetry workshops. So, when I say the word love, what do you see in your head? And people will say like, I see a heart, or I see the color red, or I see two people holding hands, or I see a flower, right? So love is something that's big and abstract. Flower is something that is concrete. It's something you can close your eyes and imagine. But you could zoom in even further. So love becomes flower. What kind of flower? Rose. Tell me more about these roses. Like how many roses? What color are they? So 12 red roses. And the question is like, where are they? What's going on around them? And it's 12 red roses in the garbage can. And then that becomes like the first line of the poem. And I mean, again, I don't want to get too in the weeds about poetry stuff, but this is like it seems really obvious when we say it like this, but this is, I think, a shift in thinking that is really, really, really powerful. To take our principles and our values and things that we care about and make them real in the world, right? Even something like, just another example. So like a poem about fear, can become a poem about a bug. What kind of bug? A spider. What kind of spider? A tarantula. Like, what's going on? Oh, I wake up and the tarantulas are looking at me, or whatever. Like, that's something that expresses the idea of fear in a deeper way. And I think it might be counterintuitive to a lot of people who maybe don't come from like an arts background, but sometimes you get to push your ideas further by not just coming at them head on. You get to stretch your message. You get to not just tell your story, but think critically about how you tell it and what you want people to walk away from with it. And so this is, all very poetry-based stuff. But I think this has a very, very clear analog in advocacy and activism about how this idea of translating ideas, issues, and concepts into moments and scenes and objects is a huge part of how I think a lot of young people that I work with, and then I can, think of my own life as well, kind of get into activism, right? So like, how do you take something that's really, really, really big, like rape culture or like misogyny or white supremacy or whatever, and zoom in on it until it's something that is small and like actionable, right? How can one individual kind of like situate themselves as part of a movement and then draw power from that specificity, as opposed to just like, oh, climate change is such a big issue, I can't do anything about it. So how do you zoom in on it? How do you make it real? I think that same zooming in exercise that we talked about with regards to love and with regards to fear can be useful for activists, right? So you start with a big global issue like, rape culture, and then if you were to zoom in on that until it's one specific action that you can do to do something about it, or that you can do to prevent it or dismantle it or disrupt it, that could be things like, well, again, if we were all in a room together, we could come up with a huge list and it'd be really cool. But the ones that come to mind for me are like, you sit down at a computer and Google what organizations in your community are doing work around, sexual violence prevention or consent. Maybe there are ways to plug in. Maybe there are ways to support them in some way, or volunteer, or become an advocate. That might then lead to someone who maybe has no experience doing this work, but who is maybe a musician, like then organizing a benefit show. So again, it's just about like specificity, right? A different path might be a student who really, really cares about this issue, but doesn't know what to do about it. So a really, really specific step might be, again, send an email to your advisor to explore like gender and women's studies classes. Like that's a really, really simple, basic thing, but it's specific, right? Another different path might be a young man setting up a dialogue circle and like securing funding for a facilitator to talk about masculinity issues with his football team or with his fraternity or something like that. But the idea being that, well, I guess as the slide says, there are two things I'm thinking about here for those of us who do activism or advocacy work. One is for people who do like educational stuff or programming, utilizing storytelling, imagery, and metaphor. It can just it can help us understand issues not just in an intellectual way, but in a deeper way. Especially, I'm thinking about this in terms of like first year orientation programs at colleges. Maybe you only have half an hour to talk about consent with every incoming student. And like we know that's not enough time, so that's a whole other like thing to figure out. But if we do have a limited amount of time, I think some of this zooming in, the specificity work can help make that time as powerful as it can possibly be. And then I think, again, for people who want to get involved and take action, zooming in from like a value or a principle or an idea or an issue that we care about, is something that's really, really specific, can be a useful activity. And this is something we can revisit again in terms of the application stuff, because that's what I'm, I think, most interested in. Is, you know, I don't know if anything here is again, super brilliant or something that you don't already know on some level, but I'm interested in how this translation stuff, both on an arts level and on an advocacy level, how it lives in the world, like how we could actually integrate it into our practice. So that's where we'll be going next. I'll again check, see if any questions or whatever. And if it's less awkward or if it makes more sense, we can also just do questions at the end. But again, feel free to throw anything into the chat box at this point. I know I talk kind of fast too, so I will I will try to be mindful of that. But yeah, so from here, let's go into some application stuff. And I have 4 ideas that come to mind for me, both based on my experience doing this kind of work and my peers who do this work in other states and other places. And I want to share 2 examples that are really specific to spoken word, because that's the community that I come from, and I think it can be really useful. But I want to share 2 others that have nothing to do with spoken word, that are about this like bigger idea of translation. Yeah, so I guess the first one is the idea of using spoken word, usually videos, but sometimes live performance, sometimes, you know, whatever else, as a dialogue builder in education spaces. Because I think, again, my like grad school research was on using spoken word as entry points to what are hopefully like deeper, more critical dialogues about some of these issues. Spoken word as a creative intervention that we can use to make these spaces more critical and I think ultimately more effective. So, you know, if you're doing a 45-minute training or a first year orientation program, or you're visiting a health class or whatever, to talk about, say, an issue like consent, I think showing a good spoken word video can do a lot of work in just 3 minutes. And I say good because they're not all good, but we can, you know, we can talk about that as well. But if you find one that you think can be really effective, I think some of the work that it can do is like it can make the issue real for people for whom it isn't already real, but like it can put a human face on an issue that for some people is still really abstract or just like an intellectual idea. It can make it real in that sense. It can be a specific entry point for a larger conversation. So like, even if the video isn't great, or even if people aren't interested in the poem, I think the poem becomes a really useful jumping off point for asking some critical questions, having some like good dialogue there. And then I think also one thing about spoken word is that it can allow young people to be the focus or be the messengers of this material themselves, as opposed to like us. I mean, I don't know who y'all are. Some of y'all might be young people too, but as opposed to us just coming in and like sharing our PowerPoint presentation about what the Title IX policies are or whatever, which again can be important. But I think as a supplementary thing, showing a video that is just a young person telling their story, saying something that is dynamic and engaging and powerful can be really, really useful. I'm thinking about, I guess, the other thing, yeah, as an icebreaker too, which I guess kind of goes along with what I've been talking about. But I'm thinking about like that T video that it seems like everyone uses, that like, you know, that cartoon where it talks about consent by paralleling it to like giving someone tea, like serving someone tea, which I'm sure a lot of y'all have seen. If you haven't, it's, you know, you can find it. And I think there are a lot of critiques of that video. There are a lot of people who love it. And I think wherever you fall on that debate, I think the thing that's interesting to me is how it can be a jumping off point then for dialogue. Because if people have critiques of it, we can talk about those critiques. If people have questions about it, we can talk about those questions. If that argument that video is making is powerful to some element of the audience, that's great. And I think the same principle is true with these spoken word videos. In a minute, we can revisit that big list that I shared before, because there are some really, really good ones. But yeah, so aside from like using the videos and stuff, I'll just share like this is like my job. Like I go to a college or a conference or a high school or a middle school. If they give me an hour or an hour and a half, I'm not just going to perform the whole time. Like I might share a poem and then ask questions of the audience or talk about it. And those tend to be really good conversations because I think, particularly when I work with young men, like the fraternity or the football team or whatever, having this content wrapped up in a story, I think can make it a little bit less scary or intimidating or whatever adjective is relevant in that situation. And it allows them, I think, at least in my experience, and I know some of this is probably my own privilege because I'm a guy saying this stuff, but it allows them to open up in a way that I think only story can really help facilitate. But again, we can come back to some of that stuff. The other point here, or the other idea for real life application, is actually just like creating spaces for spoken word stuff. Open mics and poetry slams, depending on who your audience or your like community is, can be really, really powerful spaces for expression and community building and people like making connections and stuff. Might bring in new audiences who wouldn't just come to another, prevention event or whatever. It could raise money, it can get media attention. And I think because of my background as an activist, I'm really interested in some of that like super, super practical stuff, like at a poetry event, it isn't even necessarily about the poetry, it's about the event, right? It's about getting people in a room together who wouldn't be in a room together otherwise. And I know this isn't going to be relevant to every single person in this webinar, but for those of you who do like programming and education stuff, just a quick note, I think I'm definitely available to share any specific thoughts or advice around the event side of things, like how to run these events. One thing I'd say right away is that there's a difference between poetry slams, open mics, and like curated readings. That I think those three terms get conflated a lot when they're actually different things. Like a curated reading is when you choose people who have like material that's relevant to the issue that you want to talk about to come and perform. And those can be really powerful because then that the material is going to be good. Open mics can be really powerful because, it might be someone you've never met before who does something amazing. But open mics can also be super messy because they're literally just anyone can sign up and share something. People who've done like take back the night events and stuff too. It can be really, really, really powerful, but it can also be really like you have to have someone who can host or facilitate the space so that people don't come up and say like, super triggering or traumatic or messed up things. So yeah, the pros and cons of open mics. Poetry slams, I generally, oh no. Okay. I don't generally recommend just because, if you have a big audience of people who are interested in spoken word, poetry slams can be awesome. A slam is basically, for those who don't know, it's like a competition where like people read and there's a panel of judges and you get scores and like there's a winner. And so like it can be really messed up. It can also be really powerful because it gets people excited. It's a big draw usually for an audience. So like slam is like a next level. It's like not a 1-on-1, it's like a 2-on-1 or a 3-on-1 kind of thing. But it is, an option for you. And so yeah, I think the biggest like pitfall is to not do the work first. Because again, I'm just thinking about, we're right in the middle right now here in Minnesota of like the youth poetry slam series that we do every year. And we have to be really, really, really intentional all the time about, because the spoken word stage is a space where people get to talk about things they don't usually get to talk about. It can be super traumatic. It can be triggering for the audience, for members of the audience. And so we always try to have resources like self-care resources. We always say at the beginning of every event, like, feel free to step out if you need to step out. Feel free to take care of each other and take care of yourselves. We actually have an arts therapist who's always in the space who we point out. If anyone wants to just talk to someone, you can talk to that person. That can be, really important. And then also, for the poets themselves, to make sure that they're sharing it because they want to share it and not because they feel like And this is more of a poetry slam thing, like, oh, and to get a high score in the poetry slam, I need to tell the single most traumatic story of my entire life. Like, we want to avoid that too. We want the youth sharing it to do something that is empowering to them or that is healthy for them, maybe more importantly. So that's kind of in the weeds, and I'm totally down to answer any questions or share any other thoughts about that. Yeah, so the next two ideas of like, what does this look like in real life, are less spoken word focused, right? So I'm thinking about workshop activities or, facilitated dialogues that stem from that idea of translation, but then use it to focus on activism and agency. So like a specific example is a kind of activist brainstorm that I've done before. Because I don't know what y'all find working with young people, but what I've found over the past few years is that most of the youth I work with are really, really, really smart. And particularly around issues of gender violence and consent and sexuality. Like a lot of them like know the vocabulary words, and like know the issue really well. What a lot of youth don't have, at least in my experience, is like an organizer lens. It's the whole idea of like, in school we learn about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, but we don't learn about Ella Baker or like the thousands and thousands of people who made the civil rights movement work, right? We learn about the figureheads. And I think that idea can be translated over into a lot of different situations with regards to young people, in terms of just not having a lot of what do I do about it information, because we just don't learn about organizing in school. And so the activity is to take a concept and talk about what it looks like in action. For example, the bystander intervention thing. If you're doing bystander intervention work, to just sit with a group of people and come up with a list of like, so what does bystander intervention actually look like in practice? And a lot of times, for that specific example, people will talk about, the classic conception of that, of like, you're at a party and you notice someone is acting in an unsafe way. Like, what do you do? And like, that's a real thing that we should talk about. But what I found is cutting that workshop into two pieces. Like, what does bystander intervention look like in the specific moment where that dangerous behavior is happening? But also, what does bystander intervention look like outside of that moment? Has been like just like a eureka, like light switch, flipping the light switch moment for a lot of students. Because they're both important conversations, but they're not the same conversation. So like, if someone's being catcalled on the bus, what do you do? Right? Like, that's an important conversation. But also the other conversation is, how do we create a world in which people don't get catcalled on the bus? That to me is an organizer conversation. Right? And it isn't always easy. Like, but if you get a bunch of people in a room together just to brainstorm, brilliant stuff like always comes up. Even if people have no experience doing activist work, like, people know. It's just sometimes having the opportunity to talk about that stuff is what really matters. And so like that's also like a prevention conversation too, about prevention in the moment versus prevention outside of the moment. How do we cultivate communities and spaces in which we don't have to intervene in the moment because the harmful thing hasn't even occurred, right? So that all takes this idea of zooming in and making the big broad idea, make it real. The other example there that I have is practicing consent as an individual versus building a culture of consent. That can also be a really cool conversation to kind of like cultivate activists and future advocates of like, we need to have that conversation about how we practice consent as individuals and like what consent looks like in an interpersonal space. But I think we also need to have this conversation about what does it look like to shift policy and shift culture and do the lobbying work and the policy work and all of like the activist work to build a culture of consent, so that we don't have to have the same programs every year forever. That eventually it just becomes part of the fabric of reality. That's one, again, as another resource. I didn't include it in here, but at my website, I wrote a zine, basically. I don't know if people That's like a dated term, right? But like, you know, a little booklet. But the zine is called How Do We Build a Culture of Consent? And it was written by asking that question to advocates around the country, advocates and survivors and activists and students and a bunch of different people. Like, what does that actually look like in practice? And I just recorded a bunch of different responses to that. So there's all kinds of ideas for, again, for programs, for initiative, for campaigns, for educational materials and stuff. That's really cool. And we actually divided that conversation up into not just how do you build a culture of consent, like in a general sense, but because that's a big question, right? So again, how do you zoom in? How do you make that question more specific? We divided it up into how do we do that work as individuals, like in our own kind of self-reflective space? How do we do that work on an interpersonal level with like the people we have access to in our lives, whether that's friends, family, our places of worship, our workplace, etc. And then also, how do we do that work on an institutional level, on an organizing and policy level? And so again, it really, at least in my experience, it's been able to like stretch people's brains to think about possibilities and to think about what the future might look like, a future in which we're not having the same consent workshop every, to use college as an example, every September for first year orientation, but that eventually, maybe that morphs into just like a general like healthy sexuality workshop. And then eventually maybe that just, again, becomes part of the fabric of the culture. And some of that might seem kind of utopian, but I don't think it is, right? I think like these issues that we work on in this space like are winnable issues. But yeah, that's another webinar. And then finally, the fourth kind of application idea is to think more critically about how we frame our events and programs and educational campaigns. There's this idea of hooks, right? Hooks is one of those words like, you might know what I mean just by context or whatever, but the hook in a song is like the chorus, right? It's the part that gets stuck in your head. I think about hooks in terms of poetry as like what makes your love poem different from every other love poem that's already been written by a trillion other people like throughout history, right? How do you make it stick out? How do you make it something that's original and different and cool? That I think is a question that is directly relevant to programming. So, the classic example is like, if I have a thing that's like rally for justice, that's cool, but it doesn't really communicate anything, right? So how can we be more specific? How can we make our events stick out? Now, I mean, there's a broader question here too. So like part of my research for grad school was I looked at why certain spoken word videos go viral and why other videos don't go viral. Viral just, meaning like it becomes something that people really want to share with other people because it speaks to them, or maybe because they hate it, but in this case, usually because they love it, it speaks to them, it resonates with them in some way, so they share it. They share it on their social media, they send it to people via email. So like, why do some poems have 1 million views and some poems have 10,000 views? Why do some poems have 10 million views and some poems have 10 views? And so I looked at a sample of like, just, the top, like, I think what I did is not super scientific. I looked at the top 30 most viewed videos on Button Poetry's channel. Not that views make the poem good, but again, we're getting at like what makes something that people want to share, something that's memorable, that sticks in their heads. And what I found, which I think is, all this stuff is relevant to programming and education, but what I found is like one was brevity, like 29 out of the 30 were like 3 minutes long or less. And that relates to style. They're short, they're dynamic, they're punchy. They say the thing that they want to say, and then they leave, right? I think another element was this idea of that the messenger matters. 29 out of the 30 videos in that sample were people, I guess you would like, in a general sense, call like youngish people, in that like teenager to 20s area. And that's who the audience is. So like people like to see people who look like them or who they can relate to on some level. 29 out of the 30 videos had narrative elements, so that they were telling a story. They weren't just, again, standing up on stage and like saying something true isn't necessarily what reaches people. And You know, some of this is obvious, but I think this relates to like activist work. Like I'm in Minnesota, right? And back in 2012, Minnesota, I think, was the first state to defeat a constitutional amendment referendum to ban same-sex marriage, right? Like in 20, 30 other states, this had come up as a referendum, and every state it had passed, it had passed, it had passed. Minnesota, I think, was the first state to push it back and actually vote no. And this was way back in 2012, but like to vote no. And a huge part of that um, was that the campaign, the coalition of different organizations who were trying to get people to vote no on that, were incredibly intentional about storytelling. How all the advertisements, all the materials that they produced, none of them were saying like, here are the legal and economic reasons you should vote no, or here are the constitutional reasons you should vote no, or whatever. It was all just people telling stories. You know what I mean? I'm sure like y'all know that on some level, but it's worth reiterating. That's, you know, narrative elements make a huge difference. And then finally, um, I think that there's a certain intentionality about like knowing who the audience is and like what you want to share with that audience, which relates back to everything we've been talking about. But the other one was the hook, which is this. And so I think in the same way that poems can have hooks, I think events can, programs, poster campaigns, social media campaigns, hashtags. I'm sharing a bunch of examples here of ones that I've been a part of, or like, you know, in my community here. One was you know, hashtag yes, 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 an evening of art about consent and healthy sexuality. So it's pretty broad, but I think the hashtag partly it gives it some specificity, some kind of hook. We just had, you know, 8, 9 different artists, poets, musicians, etc., sharing work about this topic. And that's the kind of thing, like, you're preaching to the choir, you're not necessarily going to bring in a ton of people who don't already agree, but like, that's okay. You're still getting people in a room together. We raised money for our local agency, and that was really cool. Another one was also a fundraiser for the local sexual violence center. It's called Shut It Down, an evening of art against street harassment. So even with those first two examples, like the second one has, I think, a little bit more specificity to it, right? Because street harassment is a really, really specific issue that people face. And so we had, again, you know, artists, poets, visual artists, and musicians sharing work that related in some way to that issue. But then we also did the whole, like, you know, the photo booth thing of like, hashtag shut it down because, and then people could write in whatever, you know, like why they were there or why that issue was important to them. And both of these, like, you know, the money raising is one aspect of it, the getting people in a room together is one aspect of it, but then also the media, right? Like when we talk about issues like rape culture and like, you know, the need for consent education, they don't always have current events hooks for local media. They often do, like, you know, the Kavanaugh thing or whatever, but a lot of times they don't because they're just big ongoing issues that are always there. You know, domestic violence, it's always an issue. And so like some of these events were just an excuse to like send out press releases to all the local media to know like, hey, here are 3 organizations right here in our community who are doing amazing work. Maybe you want to do a feature on them, or maybe you want to come and interview somebody. I think about those types of opportunities a lot. Another one, hip hop against homophobia. This was also back in 2011, 2012, when that phrase was probably a little bit more radical than it is right now, at least, you know, where I'm at in Minnesota. But back then, you know, it was a fairly radical thing. It helped raise money and raise awareness for the Vote No campaign that was happening. It involved artists who do identify as LGBTQ and then also artists who don't, just basically putting on like a good rap show. We took it around the state, so not just in the Twin Cities, but in the smaller cities as well. Smaller communities, just to get people in the room to talk about, and always had like tablers from the campaign, the Vote No campaign, to like share that information, to register people to vote, all that kind of stuff. That was a really successful series too, because again, at the time, in terms of like the zeitgeist, like that drew hundreds of people to these shows. That was really cool. You know, so a couple other random examples. There's a writing circle here in the Twin Cities called Black Lines Matter, which is just, again, a writing workshop for Black writers. But you can tell that, like, if it were just writing workshop for Black writers, it just isn't as interesting, right? So, like, they come up with a really good hook for it. Some of you probably seen the poster campaign that I think started at Ohio State called My Culture Not a Costume. It's the whole, like, you know, when people dress up and they're super racist on Halloween, like, this is a poster campaign to push back against that. Again, a really strong hook. Similarly, the I Too Am I don't know if it was just Harvard, but it was like I too am blank educational institutions talking about students of color at these big institutions and all the nonsense that they faced being in that space. And it was again a thing where people would hold up a whiteboard saying I too am blank, and then maybe in the caption tell their story. So again, some of this stuff is social media based too, like to do educational culture shifting work. I think hooks become even more important. And then one thing, again, I'd love to have like a discussion about this if we were all in the same room together, but Walk a Mile in Her Shoes, if people are familiar with that program, um, where like men in a certain community or on a certain campus like wear high heels and like do a march, right? The idea being that it raises awareness about gender violence stuff, at least that's usually what it's like associated with. Um, and I know like there's totally critiques of that, right? There's critiques and there's also places in which it's worked well, and we can have a conversation about that. But I think the thing to take away from Walk a Mile in Her Shoes is that it is a good hook. Um, and I should say the hook doesn't necessarily make a program or a poem or a campaign good, right? It just makes it memorable or it makes it stick out. And so I think some of that is stuff to think about. Like this is a tool. It's not a catch-all here, but I think hooks are really important tools for those of us who do education work and programming work. I can share, I don't have a ton more stuff. Like we might wrap up a little bit early today, but just from my own experience, like I don't know if any of you know my work. I won't I won't assume that anyone knows anything about who I am. But I of all the poems that I have on the internet, like the one that has the most attention or has the most views on like a basic mathematical level is called 10 Responses to the Phrase Man Up. I think that's a great example of what we're talking about here with hooks, and that like it's not my best poem or like my deepest or most complex poem, but it has a really strong hook. It's literally just 10 responses to the phrase "man up." One, blah blah blah. Two, blah blah blah. Three, blah blah blah. And that can be a writing exercise, right? Like for in a poetry space, that can be a what are 10 responses or 5 responses to like something that's annoying to you, like some statement or some phrase that gets on your nerves, right? It could be 10 responses to the phrase "all lives matter," or 10 responses to the phrase "go back to where you come from," or whatever. Like that can be a powerful tool, but that can also be again on an organizing level or on an advocacy level. Like you could totally put together some type of social media campaign or poster campaign or educational campaign based on that same kind of theme or format. But I found that to be really effective in the work that I do, especially with young people. And I think even more, especially with young men, right? This idea that, I mean, we talked about this a little bit already, but the art side, even if they don't have any interest in art or poetry, it becomes an entry point into these deeper conversations. And particularly doing work around masculinity stuff, what I found is that most young men aren't actually really resistant to these ideas. They just often don't have a chance to talk about them, right? Because a lot of the stuff around, toxic masculinity or like critical hegemonic masculinity stuff, like it isn't that radical, right? Like if I get into a room with a bunch of young men and I'm talking about like, hey, it's weird that men always are supposed to be strong and tough and can't show their emotions. Pretty much everyone acknowledges that that's messed up, at least in this generation, which I think is a shift, right? The issue is just having those spaces and having those conversations in the first place. At least in my experience. And art then can be a really useful kind of, I guess, platform for those conversations. Oh, let's see. This might be a great time if people have questions or thoughts. I think, there's so much more we could talk about here. Like I could talk more about the spoken word stuff, could talk more about the kind of working with young men, using the arts stuff. This is just my information for anyone who's interested. Yeah, I will have a sip of water and see if people have any thoughts. The only other thing that I had planned potentially was to go through that list a little bit of um, spoken word videos that can be useful in these situations and just kind of shout a few out for people who are looking for material about a very specific issue that they do education or programming work around. Just kind of as little case studies. Yeah.
Cool. Kyle, a couple of questions have come in. The first one
Okay.
is, Do you have any suggestions for Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month activity-wise?
Okay, I'm making a note. Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. Um, so I don't have like, a specific program that I can share with you that I've done in the past about that, but I think what I found is, I don't want to say something that's like too obvious here, but it's to work with the teenagers, to see how they frame that and how they think about it, to create space for them to help grow that or to help create that program or that campaign in the first place. I think what comes to mind for me, based on what we've talked about today, are I guess two things. Like one, for a longer like campaign, there's some of the stuff about a hook. Like we can think of like a cool hashtag, or like a lot of programs or a lot of spaces have those like photo booths, basically. Like you don't need a whole actual photo booth, but like come up with some kind of guiding question or like a critical question where people write their own answers and then take a selfie holding their answer. I found that, again, just like on a basic like people level, really working with young people, those have been really successful. I don't know if it's just because people like selfies or what, but it also, though, it's not just the selfie thing. Like it allows people again to share their own knowledge and their own expertise in that space. Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. The other part of that, that I was thinking of was, I guess two thoughts. One is how we frame that in terms of like healthy relationship stuff and healthy dating, so it isn't all here are the things that are, here are the things not to do. Which I don't have a hard line on that, because like sometimes we have to have that conversation. But I think for something like this, particularly when youth are involved in the creation of it, it can be cool to create something that can help celebrate like healthy behavior. At least what I found in doing work around consent is that that's been a really resonant thing with a lot of young people. Is yes, we have to have the conversation about like what unhealthy sexuality and like rape culture and sexual assault look like, but we can also at the same time have a conversation about like healthy sexuality and communication and all of that stuff. And I think that can be relevant to this topic too. And then just based on like the 4 application things, this could be the kind of topic where like an open mic could be useful. But again, that's always a dangerous thing. Like your people better than I know them, but it's a broad topic, but it has enough specificity where it can be a really cool event, I feel like. What I mean by that is like it's specific enough where it can be a themed event. If you did have an open mic, some kind of like space for people to share their work or their stories about that topic, but it's also broad enough where people can approach that topic from very different ways, like from very different angles, which I think is it's a good, like, it's a useful space to be in, or it's like an opportunity, I think. I mean, that's what comes to mind for me. I wish, I don't know if y'all have any other ideas or thoughts. I don't know if we're sharing them in the chat box or what. Oops, I went back.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to reiterate to make sure if you have any ideas or suggestions or what it is that you're doing for Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, feel free to type it in and I can read those out loud. Kyle, we have a couple more questions. Another one that came in was, do you ever do poetry writing workshops with young folks?
Yes. That's funny. That's like 2/3 of my work is arts-based programs that are about specific topics. So like about masculinity, about consent, about whiteness and white supremacy or whatever. But then the other third of what I do is very arts specific. So like here in Minnesota, I'm part of a couple of different artist rosters that place teaching artists in high schools and middle schools around the state. And that might be, a week-long residency to really go into depth on poetry and performance. Sometimes it's just like a one-time thing too. But what I found is, well, I mean, so like the short answer is yes. I think the longer answer is that those spaces can also be really useful, because like I can go into a school kind of under the auspices of like, I talk about poetry, and I do talk about poetry, but through talking about poetry, we also get to talk about all this stuff, like all the stuff about identity and power and privilege and agency and all of that, like comes up naturally in these conversations about poetry. And so I think sometimes there's a certain element of like, you know, you can be kind of, I don't want to say sneaky, but like, you know, if you have a program on a college campus or in a certain community isn't necessarily about the issues that we're talking about today or the issues that y'all work on as advocates, you can still make it kind of about those issues, or it can still be a space for those issues to happen. And I think in workshops and educational spaces specifically, that's a very like fertile terrain for that, at least in my experience. Yeah.
Cool. And the next question is, do you have any statistics around this topic of art and violence prevention? And they mentioned they appreciate your work and ideas.
Oh, thank you. In terms of statistics, there's been a couple of studies. I don't have it handy right now. I know I just received a big packet of how some of that stuff works here in Minnesota. And then I know there's also been a couple of national studies about how arts programs increase youth engagement like in school. I don't know if I have anything that's really specific to like gender violence stuff or consent stuff. I think it's funny because on one level, like the work that I do around using the arts to have those kinds of conversations, like it's not super revolutionary, right? Like I think people have used the arts to talk about stuff forever, and like advocates are using different materials and videos and arts-based things in a lot of different ways. But I think it's also, even though it's not revolutionary, it is kind of weird and new enough that there isn't a ton of information out there on it. You know, I get like what are they called? The little like evaluations of my programs, but that's such a small, you know, sample size. I don't think I have any larger statistical information about this specifically. And I'm out of grad school now, so that is no longer my job. I shouldn't have said it like that, but you know what I mean.
Cool. Hey, Kyle, I have a question. Can you tell folks a little bit about the zines that you've done and kind of how that works, how that came about, how they might be able to put that into practice in their own spaces?
Yeah, so I'm sharing my screen. I'm gonna go out of the slideshow for a second. I think this will work, right? If I just go to my website, you can all see that, right?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so a couple of things. Well, one, I'll make it a little bigger. Okay. One, the zine specifically, and then we'll go back to some of the other stuff. But, well, this is a new thing I wrote about the Gillette commercial, if anyone's interested in that. I'm scrolling down to the zine thing. Sorry, I didn't have it bookmarked, but it's right here. Okay, so if you go to my website, it's from this past year, it's from October, so it's easy to find in like the archives. This is what it looks like. And I don't know how much of this, I don't have like data to back this up, but I'm really curious about this idea of like zines is kind of a throwback, something that was really popular like years ago, right? Or, you know, kind of a subculture years ago of people writing about the stuff that's important to them and actually printing little like zines or booklets of them. I wonder about the culture kind of swinging back that way in terms of people just being sick of social media and sick of the internet and having something that's super, super concrete that you can hold in your hands and share with someone. I don't know. I've been really interested in that lately, just kind of because of that reason. But this specific zine, How Do We Build a Culture of Consent, is available here. You can actually, you know, you can read all of the text that's in the zine, plus a bunch of links and stuff. But then you can also download the actual the PDF of it. And this particular format is really fun and it's cool. Like it's a little labor intensive in that like you cut a slit and you fold it a certain way so that it becomes a little like 8-page book. And like they're beautiful and like they're cute. And I totally encourage people to like write your own. But like this is one, like again, if you want to download it and steal it for yourself, I printed on 11 by 17 paper and then fold it. There's directions in here on how to fold it. But this has been really cool because that way, anytime I go to a school, and a lot of times like they might bring me out to have that like one-on-one conversation about like what is consent and like how do we practice consent as individuals. But I also have this resource as something I can share like when the program is over. Like, so we've had that conversation. For anyone who wants to like keep moving or like keep having those conversations or who wants to get more involved, please, take this little booklet. It's full of, 100 different action, well, not 100, but a bunch of different action ideas about what that looks like in practice, right? So like the first couple pages are just, the basic definitional stuff about what consent is. And then the section about as individuals, here are some things we can do. In community with one another, here are a bunch of things we can do. On an organizing and policy level, here are things we can do. And then also a ton of resources, right? So like, I think it's really important that youth know about organizations that already exist, in case they want to plug in or take that advocate training and become an advocate, or start a chapter of like PAVE or Men Can Stop Rape, or like one of those organizations on their campus, or in their high school too. And then just a bunch of different kind of like books in case people want to like do more of a deep dive into the stuff. And then, yeah, the zine is a limited space, so I can't, include every book, but I tried to have a cool, diverse array of different resources. But I don't know. I think even though I'm an artist, I think I'm a very, very practical thinker. So I love this idea of like, here is again a small concrete thing that's packed with resources and ways to turn people into, from people who like agree with the issue or who are knowledgeable about the issue to people who are interested in kind of translating that agreement into action, and whatever that looks like. I know, different people in different places, that's going to look different, but that's kind of where that project came from. Did you have, I mean, as long as we're at the website, I can really quickly show this. So let's see. So this is my website. There's this resources tab. This list here, a beginner's guide to spoken word and slam poetry. Yeah, that's the title. But the idea is that here are these like categories. So this one's on feminism, masculinity, and gender. And here are a bunch of like good poems. And I say that intentionally, and that like not every poem about a topic that I agree with I like. These are all poems that I actually like, or that I think have something to offer on an artistic level and on like a content level. Some ones that really, really stick out to me are Sierra DeMulder's poem Paper Dolls, which is, again, it's not just about like sexual assault as like a general thing. It zooms in, there's a specificity to it. Paper Dolls is about how we as a society respond to survivors and how dangerous, or not dangerous, but how harmful it can be sometimes when that response isn't holistic. Like when that response is, I think there's a line in the poem that says like, you can either laugh proudly or cry beautifully or something, like how survivors are only allowed certain expressions, and how like dangerous that can be. So again, there's a specificity to it that I think is really, really powerful, especially, for survivors. There's a poem like Dylan Garrity's Friend Zone, which uses, the first half, like what's the thing about spoken word that's so incredible, like tactically, like the first half of his poem kind of is like it's the stereotypical idea of what the friend zone is. Like it's this guy complaining about how like, oh, girls only want to be my friends and I never get to have sex, and blah, blah, and like people laugh and like they play along with it. And then halfway through the poem, it flips where he's like, actually, that whole concept is really, really messed up and toxic and violent. The idea that men are entitled to women. Like, so it like brings the audience into the space using humor, and then it uses that humor to flip it back around. Some of my own poems too, like I have a poem about consent called Consent to 10,000 Feet, which was written to be used in like consent workshops, right? Or in educational spaces to talk about consent. My poem, not to talk about myself too much, but like my poem Action is a poem that, it's about the importance of men talking to other men preemptively and proactively about sexual assault. Not just believing the right things, but actually taking action to have those conversations in our peer groups. And it says that all through story, right? Just storytelling. It isn't, a manifesto. It's just telling a story. Yeah, there's a lot of really good stuff here. And then on to other topics as well. If you find yourself, if any of you do other kinds of like social justice ed stuff, there's some really, really good stuff here. And then, sorry, there's one other, like on this page, there's a couple specific links of like smaller collections. Like this one is specifically for people who want to have conversations about consent and rape culture with students. and I shared a bunch of poems plus little like blurbs about why those poems might be useful or like how they might be useful in those situations. Um, Plus a bunch of just readings and resources. So again, some of this stuff is really practical. It's just like I want to create databases of resources for people doing this work, so that it, so it can be useful. Yeah. Were there any other thoughts, questions?
Someone mentioned that as far as this zine was concerned, that it was really cool. Thank you so much for coming up with this. And otherwise, people haven't typed anything else in. So I want to give you all the opportunity to if you have any questions about the content of the webinar or the website that Kyle is showing us right now, or anything else that you have been thinking about. I do want to say I've used several of Kyle's pieces in a lot of my presentations, and they are such a great conversation starter in ways that I wouldn't have been able to start the conversation just on my own. So I just want to encourage you all to look at a lot of these poems, a lot of these pieces, and use them to start that conversation, because it, like I said, it's amazing how much other people can just think of something that they wouldn't have thought of had they not seen a piece. So again, just encouraging that. Anything else that you'd like to share, Kyle, with folks?
I mean, one thing we didn't talk a lot about, and some of it might be obvious, but it's worth at least putting out there, is that the other side of poetry and spoken word as a resource here isn't just for like people hearing the poems, it's like the writing, right? Like poetry can be a really powerful way to process experiences and to process how we think about things. And we don't need to go super into depth on that, but I think it is, when we talk about like potential programs, like we can do open mics, we can do curated readings, we can do poetry slams. But yeah, as someone kind of brought up, we can also do like writing circles and like writing spaces, whether or not people even want to perform or like share them, but just to sit and write can be really, really powerful and healthy. And I think to sit and write in community with each other, or like in a room together, I think there's something really powerful about that as well. Yeah, I mean, I also say like, this is what I do. So if any of y'all, want to get in touch, feel free to shoot me a message. I shared my email in the slideshow. I'm coming out to Boulder, and well, I guess it's not until the fall, like in November or something. But I travel like every week, so I'm always down to listen to ideas, or even if it isn't me, like to share other artists who do this kind of work, or to share just other resources in case it can be useful to you.
Great, Kyle. We have a couple of comments that we wanted to share with you. The first one is, someone just printed your zine and is excited to connect with the other prevention educator where they work about this stuff. And someone else said, I'm leading a lunch and learn about toxic masculinity for professionals in the community. I'm going to utilize your website and the info you shared. So good comments there.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, one thing I can share just really briefly too. So we have a little bit of time, right? I'm not going to talk, like, we're not over time, right?
No, we still have scheduled about 15 minutes.
Yeah. So I've been spending this past year spending a lot of time in Wisconsin, just right next door to where I'm at in Minnesota. Because in one community in like the Fox Valley, like the Appleton, Oshkosh area of Wisconsin, they've been able to do this really cool thing where like every year they have a breakfast like that, and they invite 1,000 kind of business leaders and government people and like just mostly men from the community to have this breakfast, and then talk specifically about toxic masculinity and gender violence prevention. And it's done in conjunction with the local agencies. So it's like this coalition of business leaders and the survivor like support agencies. And then on top of the breakfast, they do a bunch of like presentations in the middle schools and the high schools. And so like last year it was Brenda Tracy, who people know Brenda. She does mostly work in like athletics. So she travels, she's a survivor. She goes to colleges and talks to like football teams and athletics departments. And then I was there too. Did our network cut out? Can you hear me?
Yeah, hello? I can hear you. You're still there.
Okay, cool. And so then I went along to kind of do the opening act. So like I have a couple of poems that like open up the space, and then she tells her story, and then I have another poem at the end or whatever. Um, and then we did the same thing this past year with a different person who's also a survivor. Um, and like that model just was really cool. And I'm wondering how much that can be replicated in other spaces. Sorry, the audio thing threw me off. I forgot why I brought that up. But I'm interested in these types of models, these like alternative models to reaching parts of the community that like don't get reached. And the fact that this was in Wisconsin, I think is telling too. Like if it can happen in Wisconsin, it might be able to happen in a lot of other places. um, yeah. Oh yeah. There was something else there, but I don't know.
Someone asked Kyle if you had more information on on that event, a title, a link that they might be able to access to get more information.
For the Wisconsin thing?
Yes, for the breakfast.
Yeah, it's called this is actually an interesting organization. It's called Voices of Men. Um I think it's a project of like the local like Goodwill or something. But they have this website, which I've pulled up their website, where like they do the breakfast every year. But then this like resource is actually pretty cool. Like they have this thing called, this link is 11 things men can do. And in each one of those things, so like one of them being to listen to women. You click on that, there's a bunch of different like videos and links and quotes and resources, and each one of this was originally a poster campaign. So it's what are 12 things men can do to end gender violence. So I think they call it sexual assault and domestic violence. Um, and then in each one of them, there's a bunch of different resources. So yeah, that's just Voices of Men, Fox Valley. But it's a model that they're replicating in other parts of Wisconsin now. So like I did one in La Crosse, which is a fairly small city. It's like 50,000 people. And I think we're talking about Madison, Milwaukee, the other cities too. But yeah, feel free to check that stuff out. Um, it was also a situation in which the one paid employee that they have ended up doing like some predatory stuff, and it shows that like, I mean, definitely they got rid of him and he's gone now, but like it shows that even in these types of spaces, like you can never let your guard down. But the actual website has a lot of cool stuff on it, if nothing else. And they've done a lot of good like accountability and responsibility stuff since that happened. So yeah, sorry, that's kind of a downer caveat, but it's important I think to throw out there. Okay.
Cool. Well, we don't have any other questions coming in. So at this point, I think we'd like to go ahead and say thank you, Kyle, for presenting. That was such valuable information for us to have. And thank you for sharing that and for your time and for sharing all of these resources that are very useful and important for the work that we do. I do have some other announcements. Again, just look out for an email containing the copy of the presentation, and you'll have access to those links that were on there as well. I should be sending that within the next 30 minutes after the session is done. And we do have a couple of webinars coming up in February. The first one is called PRIA, Understanding the Roles of Correctional Staff and Community Advocates. That will be on Monday, February 11th. And then because of Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, we did want to do something geared towards teens. So on February 13th, we will be having a webinar titled A Guide to Juvenile Sexting Prevention in Colorado. Again, that will be the 13th from 12 to 1. Please keep an eye out for those and sign up if you're interested. The other thing, again, just want to remind you to fill out the survey. Those are very helpful for us, and make note on there anything else that you'd like to see from us, whether it's something along these lines of how to use art, or different ways of utilizing or diversifying our prevention efforts. anything really that you'd like to see so that I can set that up for us. And just want to say thank you all for attending, for being here. And again, Kyle, thank you one more time for sharing this valuable information with us.
Yeah, thank you. I hope it can be useful.
Awesome. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon. Stay warm.